Hi, this is Shannon, and welcome to my reflective journey in becoming a teacher. I'm here to share with you how I've grown from a student teacher into a teacher ready and excited to join the teaching profession. During my Education 400 experience, I developed an image of what I thought growth looked like when made with fallen leaves from the trees in my neighborhood. Each leaf represents questions I had as I started PDP. It is through questions that we, as people, learn to grow and are pushed to become. What I think is the most valuable part of this tree analogy is that these leaves, or questions if you will, don't stay on the branch forever. The leaves fall to the ground, returning to the earth to nurture the soil. As leaves fall to the ground, they become homes for small insects and rodents to burrow under, as well as becoming nutrients for the soil as they decompose. Those nutrients help trees to continue their process of growth, stretching taller, growing more branches, and budding leaves. The cycle repeats, and leaves give birth to new life, just as questions give birth to more nuanced inquiry. Each question, if explored, can help me grow as a person and nourish new growth and ultimately more questions. I found that these questions I had been exploring showed up in my practicum experience. The questions morphed and became more nuanced, fueling my own inquiry and aided in my students driving inquiry in the classroom. What I would like to share are two questions that I had prior to my practicum experience and how those questions shifted and impacted my pedagogy. The first question I had was, how can schools aim to creatively involve students with exceptionalities and differences in facilitating the school environment and atmosphere? Let me set the stage. My Social Studies 10 classroom consisted of diverse voices offering valuable insight into the makeup of the classroom community. I made a habit of remembering students' names and using each name in classroom conversation. I wanted to form a genuine connection with my students. This included the feedback I provided. While engaging in classroom discussion, I would repeat what a student said for two reasons. Firstly, to ensure that I did not misrepresent their contribution. Secondly, so each student in class could hear the valuable insight of their peers. This was foundational in creating a safe space for students to share and be confident that their voice mattered. As students contributed to class discussion, I continued to connect their points to class content and provide credit to each student. This encouraged students to consistently share their perspective. For instance, I actually ended up quoting a student and including that student's quotation within their summative assessment piece. But what does this have to do with my inquiry question from Education 400? Let me introduce you to one of my students with autism spectrum disorder. He taught me what creating an inclusive environment looks like and how curating it for him benefits all students involved. Let's provide the student a pseudonym. Let's call him Ralph. In Ralph's IEP, he shared that he would rather his peers label him as weird than having ASD. This shows the power labels can have over individuals, and Ralph wanting the agency to provide himself with a label of his own choosing. That being said, I found that the biggest obstacle I had to overcome in creating an inclusive classroom was developing a cohesive community that genuinely wanted to include Ralph without my prodding. Ralph's caseworker and I met to discuss the IEP and strategies that I could implement in the classroom to benefit Ralph and everyone involved. The student struggles with shouting out his answers for the entire class and exhibits off-task behavior. Initially, I struggled with how I could shut down the off-task behavior without interrupting him. I didn't want to model interruption as an acceptable classroom practice for other students under my care. After much deliberation and discussion with colleagues, we concluded that shutting down off-task behavior was protecting Ralph because the other students would not have had an opportunity to poke fun at his outbursts. My interjections were necessary to promote a safe, inclusive classroom environment. Part of shutting down off-task behavior involved me modulating my energy levels and tone of voice to soothe Ralph as I asked if his comments were related to the topic at hand. I will share two examples that examine how shifting my tone and energy levels impacted the student with ASD and the class as a whole. Part of the lesson that I taught introduced the Indian Act to the students. My passion for the topic could be heard in the tone of my voice as my energy increased and I became more serious. This riled up Ralph, and his comments were intensified as he became more agitated. This negatively affected the dynamics of the entire class and shifted our conversation away from the lesson goal. After reflecting on the class, I began to monitor how my energy levels impact my tone and classroom environment. During a lesson on the Holocaust, I adjusted accordingly and successfully navigated Ralph's off-task comments while maintaining the necessary classroom dynamics. The lesson discussing the Holocaust contained other strategies to include Ralph in classroom discussion and community. I dimmed the lights to accommodate for the amount of sensory overload and created an atmosphere to reflect the heavy topic we were about to discuss. The chairs were moved into a circle to encourage eye contact and conversation. Ralph didn't want to sit in the circle, as he likes to sit in the same spot every day, with a desk to accommodate his laptop and a view of the entire room. We compromised by moving his desk close to the circle and opening the chairs to make him a part of the experience. Ralph still participated, and his peers could see him as a part of the circle created, emphasizing a classroom community. A community began to form in the classroom as I learned how to support Ralph. Ralph and others would stay for lunch and begin to discuss topics that everyone was interested in, like Dungeons and Dragons and U.S. politics. The other students began to appreciate Ralph's input and invited him into their group's in-class discussion. They would no longer get annoyed when he raised his hand to participate. This student was a valuable member of our classroom community. Small changes I made for him benefited all of the students. The inclusive classroom provided every student with more choice and a more observant teacher. By curating a learning space for students to be vulnerable, honest, and engaged, I began to reflect on a second question from Education 400. How can educators empower students to think critically and creatively about the content they are learning, including how it is presented and how we choose to embody the learning process? This question showed up in my assessment practice throughout my practicum. By using a variety of methods, I help students understand how ethical and responsible assessment works. For instance, I formulated a role-play exercise as the students generated popular culture questions that I might not be able to answer in an interview. The students took on the role of the teacher, using assessment language in a rubric to provide me with specific observable feedback after the interview process. A group of students asked me about Charli D'Amelio, an influential TikTok user. I had no idea who Charli was, and at one point thought Charli was a famous dog. I knew I was incorrect by the heightened laughter in the classroom. I modeled the messy parts of learning for my students to see. I showed my students how to incorporate feedback and work towards improvement. This formative learning process helped my students unpack assessment language and curate their own learning as they moved from interviewer to interviewee throughout the lesson. My students flourished when I empowered them in directing their learning and provided choices in learning and assessment. Engaging with backwards design and creating poignant questions for the students to grapple with became an integral part of my teaching practice. My final week teaching Social Studies 10, I began with a new group of students learning about ideology and systems of governance. By employing backwards design, I curated lessons and activities leading to an assignment that asked the students to explore a specific ideology, two public figures who represent that ideology, and characteristics of leadership those figures exhibit. But how did I get there? We began our exploration with play. The lesson was loosely based off of a board game called Snake Oil. The premise involves a customer with a new identity each round and a group of inventors pitching their inventions to their specific customer. Each inventor is given 5 unrelated words and asked to combine 2 words, ultimately creating a new invention. The challenge is coming up with a creative sales pitch, targeting your customer. Perhaps the customer was a dog walker, and an inventor combined the word fountain and puppy to create a puppy fountain. The inventor knew their customer and was tasked to generate a narrative to convince the customer to purchase their invention rather than their competition's invention. After my students completed this activity, I asked them, how did you convince someone to accept your idea, or in this case, your invention? My students began to describe physical attributes and actions, like making eye contact, sounding confident, and being personable. As students shared more answers, I shifted the conversation by introducing 2 new questions in the form of word clouds. What qualities make a good leader? What qualities make a bad leader? Students inputted words for each question, forming the word clouds and the basis for the remainder of the class discussion. Students began to see connections between successfully convincing their customer to purchase their product and qualities of good and bad leadership. The transition into ideology flowed nicely, and once students began their inquiry project, it was evident that the students were able to consider if the public figure they chose was able to convince their audience to believe their ideology, and if the public figure presented that ideology well. Here are some of my students' voices sharing their thoughts.
Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about fascism, Hitler. How influential were these leaders' ideas?
As we all know, even though Hitler's ideas and beliefs may be negative to the rest of the world, he still had a big influence on his people during World War II. He convinced over 18 million men to join his army to kill off an estimated 21 million people, including Jewish, homosexual, and other people of religions. So I guess you could say that he was a very influential person to the German people.
How could he be very influential to those people, but kill a bunch of people in his population?
So for Hitler, he was a very good leader for the Nazis, but to clarify, his intentions were not positive for the rest of the world. His characteristics were a lot of the requirements to be a strong leader. He had good communication skills towards his people by using strategies such as a clear voice, having good hand gestures, and putting fear into others by using propaganda and brutal force on others.
But the thing is, he convinced everyone that he was a good leader inside of Germany. People in America, Britain, and France, all those other allied unions, they didn't think that Hitler was a good person. They didn't think that Hitler would have been a good person, and they were right. He wasn't a good person at all. And he was a good leader in a way that he was convincing to his own people. He believed that he could get the most for his people, and that's what drove the people in his country. But people in other countries, they did not like Hitler that much, and they were very skeptical of him. Very, very nice. And that concludes our time to our political ideology assignment questions. Thank you for listening, and bye.